My son was on an operating table for 6 hours, having open heart surgery, and my in-laws were 3 states away, arguing with a golf pro about their tea time. I found out about both things within the same week, and neither one prepared me for what came after. My name is Rachel Coleman. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a pediatric nurse at a children's hospital in Charlotte. I've spent my career watching families show up for their kids during the worst moments of their lives. I never imagined I'd spend one of the worst moments of my own life watching my son's grandparents choose a golf course over him. My son Owen was born with a congenital heart defect, a narrowing of one of the valves that required monitoring from birth and, eventually, a series of corrective surgeries. The first one happened when he was 2, relatively minor as these things go, though nothing about heart surgery on a toddler ever feels minor when you're the one sitting in the waiting room. The second, more serious surgery was scheduled for the spring he turned 5. My husband Derek and I told his parents, Bill and Carol, about the surgery date the moment we had it confirmed, nearly 4 months in advance. We didn't ask them to be in the operating room, obviously. We asked them to be present that day, in the waiting room, for Owen, and honestly, for us. Derek's an only child. His parents are the only grandparents Owen has on that side. And they'd always made a point of telling everyone how close they were to him, how they never missed a school play or a birthday. 2 weeks before the surgery, during a Sunday phone call, Carol mentioned almost as an aside that she and Bill had a golf trip planned with some friends, the Hendersons in Myrtle Beach. The trip fell during the exact week of Owen's surgery. When I reminded her gently that the surgery was that Tuesday, she paused for a second and then said, "Oh, we'll just do a quick call after. You know how Bill gets about missing golf with the Hendersons. It's been on the books for months. It had not been mentioned to us once in those months. I want to be clear about something, because when I've told this story before, people sometimes assume I'm exaggerating the stakes to make a point. I'm not. This wasn't a school recital or a routine pediatrician visit. This was open heart surgery on a 5-year-old. The kind of procedure where the surgeon sits you down beforehand and explains, in careful, serious language, the real risks involved. The kind where you sign consent forms with your hand shaking slightly even though you're trying to look calm for your child. I didn't argue with Carol on the phone. I'd learned over 9 years of marriage that arguing with her rarely changed anything. It just extended the conversation. I said okay, and I hung up, and I told myself it didn't matter. That Derek and I would be there, and that was what counted. The morning of the surgery, Derek and I sat in a sterile, air-conditioned waiting room for 6 hours. We barely spoke. We held hands. I remember staring at a muted television playing a cooking show, not tasting the coffee I kept forgetting was in my hand. My phone buzzed twice during those 6 hours. Both times it was Carol. The first text asked what the weather was like back home. The second asked if I'd happened to see her sunglasses, the ones she thought she'd left in our guest room during her last visit. Owen came out of surgery successfully. The surgeon walked into the waiting room and told us it had gone well, that his recovery looked good. And I remember sitting down right there on the floor of the hallway and crying. The kind of crying that comes from 6 hours of held breath finally releasing. Derek sat down next to me and we just held onto each other for a while. That evening, once Owen was settled and stable in recovery, I called Carol to update her. She answered from what sounded like a restaurant, loud conversation and clinking glasses in the background. When I told her the surgery had gone well, she said, "Oh good, glad that's over." And then, almost immediately, "Tell Owen Grandma says hi," before telling me she had to go because the appetizers had just arrived at the table. I sat with that phone call for a long time after we hung up. I told myself people process things differently, that maybe she needed the distraction, that maybe I was being too hard on her. I've since learned that when you find yourself constructing that many excuses for someone else's behavior, it's usually a sign that you already know something is wrong, and you're just not ready to admit it yet. Owen spent 4 days in the hospital recovering. Derek and I took turns sleeping in the uncomfortable pull-out chair by his bed, running on almost no rest, trying to keep our jobs from falling apart remotely between hospital shifts. On the third night, I was sitting alone in the hospital cafeteria around 11 at night, eating a sandwich from the vending machine because it was the only thing still open, when my phone rang. It was Bill. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some old habit of politeness made me answer. "Rachel," Bill said, his voice completely casual, the tone of someone calling about something entirely unremarkable. There was no mention of Owen, no question about how the surgery had gone, no acknowledgement that his grandson had just had heart surgery 3 days earlier. "So listen, our rental car up here in Myrtle Beach had some kind of transmission issue, and Carol and I need to head back a day early anyway for her doctor's appointment. Any chance we could borrow your Highlander for a few days while ours is in the shop?" I sat there in the fluorescent light of that cafeteria, genuinely unsure for a second that I'd heard him correctly. My son had just had open heart surgery. His grandparents had chosen a golf trip over being present for it. They hadn't called once during the surgery, hadn't asked a single follow-up question about his recovery in the days since. And now, the first real request Bill was making of me wasn't about Owen at all. It was about my car. "Bill," I said slowly, "Owen is still in the hospital, right?" "Of course," he said, in the tone you'd use acknowledging someone had a minor scheduling inconvenience. "So, about the car, something in me went very still and very cold in that moment. I've thought about that feeling a lot since then. It wasn't rage exactly. It was closer to clarity, the kind that arrives all at once after being avoided for a long time. "No," I said. "You can't borrow my car." He sounded genuinely surprised, maybe even a little wounded. "Rachel, it's just a car. We're family." "You're right," I said. "It is just a car. And Owen's surgery was just heart surgery, and I guess golf mattered more. So no, Bill, you can't borrow my car." I hung up before he could respond. I sat in that cafeteria for a few more minutes, staring at my half-eaten sandwich, feeling something shift permanently in how I understood my in-laws. When Derek came to relieve me at the hospital later that night, I told him what happened. I'll admit I expected him to make excuses for his parents, the way he sometimes did, a lifetime habit of smoothing things over. Instead, I watched his face go through something I hadn't seen before, a kind of quiet devastation followed by a hardening. The same look I'd seen once when a project he'd spent months on at work fell apart because of someone else's negligence. The look of someone who has just stopped giving another person the benefit of the doubt. He didn't say much that night. But a week later, once Owen was home and settled, Derek called his parents. I wasn't in the room for the call, but he told me about it afterward. He asked them directly why they hadn't been there, why they hadn't called during the surgery, why the first real conversation with him after everything had been about a car. Carol's response was the thing that actually changed everything for me. She told Derek he was being dramatic, that Owen was fine, and then she said, "This is exactly why we didn't make a bigger deal of the trip beforehand. We knew Rachel would make it about her." That sentence sat with me for days. It wasn't just dismissive. It revealed something I hadn't fully understood yet. That this wasn't an isolated lapse in judgment. This was a pattern. One they'd been quietly managing around us for a long time. One where their own comfort always came first and any resistance from us got reframed as us being difficult. So I started looking back. Owen's first surgery, 2 years earlier, had been smaller, but Carol had missed that one too, telling us at the time she had an unavoidable work conference. A few weeks after Owen's second surgery, while going through old photos for a project, I came across an old Facebook post of Carol's from the week of that first surgery. A photo from a resort pool with a caption about finally getting a vacation in. She hadn't been at a conference. She'd taken time off and just never corrected the story she'd told us. Around that same time, Derek got an unexpected call from his aunt, Bill's sister, who he wasn't especially close with. She sounded upset and told him she'd heard that Derek and I had been keeping Owen away from his grandparents, limiting their visits, making things difficult for no reason. Derek was stunned. We'd never limited anything. If anything, we'd been the ones consistently inviting them, consistently making space for them, and getting increasingly thin excuses in return. It became clear, piecing things together, that Bill and Carol had spent a good part of the last year quietly telling extended family a very different version of events. One where their absence was our fault, not theirs. It explained some strange, cold interactions we'd had with relatives at a cousin's wedding a few months earlier, comments that hadn't made sense to us at the time. Derek didn't call his parents again to argue about it. Instead, he did something quieter and, I think, far more effective. He organized a small family dinner, the first one in months, and made a point of inviting his aunt. I wasn't sure it was a good idea, honestly. But he felt like the truth needed a room full of witnesses rather than another private phone call that could later be denied or reframed. At the dinner. Once everyone had settled and the conversation had moved through the usual small talk, Derek pulled out his phone. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said he wanted to clear something up, since he understood there'd been a story going around about him and me keeping Owen from his grandparents. He read the actual surgery dates out loud, both of them. And then read Carol's old Facebook caption from the week of the first surgery. The one about finally getting a vacation in. The table went quiet in a way I don't think I'd ever experienced at a family gathering before. Bill's sister looked directly at Carol and asked quietly if that was true. Carol didn't deny the dates or the post. She got defensive instead, said everyone was twisting her words, that she never said we were keeping Owen from them exactly. And then she stood up and left the table. Bill followed her out a moment later, but not before turning back to Derek and saying, "Your mother's not well, you know. You should be more patient with her," delivering one last guilt trip on his way out the door. Even with the evidence sitting right there on the table, nobody at that table needed us to say anything else after that. They'd seen it for themselves, in Carol and Bill's own reaction, which told the truth more clearly than any argument we could have made. In the months that followed, something shifted quietly within the extended family. Several of Derek's relatives, including his aunt, started reaching out to us directly, bypassing Carol the way they used to filter everything through her. Bill and Carol never issued an actual apology, not the kind that names what happened and takes responsibility for it. What we got instead were vague comments about wanting to move forward and not dwell on the past, but they also never asked to borrow anything from us again. And their visits, when they did happen, came with none of the old assumptions. Owen is doing wonderfully now. 2 years past that second surgery, a normal, energetic 8-year-old who has no memory of any of it. Who thinks his heart scar is cool and tells people it's from a shark bite because it gets a better reaction than the truth. I remember every hour of it though. I remember the waiting room, the phone call about the sunglasses, the request to borrow my car 3 days after his surgery. What I learned through all of it is that some people will never actually apologize. Not in the way you need them to, not in a way that acknowledges the full weight of what they did. But you don't need their apology to understand exactly who they are. Sometimes the clearest thing a person can tell you about themselves is what they ask for in the moment right after they've hurt you the most.